Leave it with you.
Grand, thank you very much. Nice to see you all. I'm not surprised. People are busy. I'm not surprised lots of people thought they were going to come and haven't managed to. Have I shared my screen? Are you seeing my screen now?
We are indeed, yeah.
I'm going to sort of gallop through a number of things and then give you a little bit of time of discussion as we move along. Here's a funny thing, is it? Pastoral care in lockdown. I mean, actually, technically, it's pastoral care in ease lockdown now, isn't it? But it's such a funny thing to be thinking about with you. I don't know why this image came into my mind, but I decided that talking to you about pastoral care in lockdown would be a little bit like talking to lorry drivers during lockdown. The fact is, lorry drivers are driving their lorries in lockdown, just as you are doing pastoral care in lockdown. And me telling you how to do pastoral care in lockdown or suggesting things that you might do just seems a little bit arrogant. A bit like telling a lorry driver how to drive their lorry. I mean, and the danger is that it all becomes pretty puerile. You know, look, lorry driver, there are fewer cars and you need to wash your hands more often. And I could end up saying some pretty sort of banal things about pastoral care in lockdown. What I'm going to try and do is to try and avoid saying too many of the obvious things and just try and hit some sort of left field issues that I hope might be helpful. Here are some preliminaries. We need to define our terms, don't we? I mean, what do we mean by we're talking about pastoral care in lockdown? Pastoral care is shepherding care, isn't it? That's the idea of the pastor. He's the shepherd. And so as soon as we say it in those terms, we're talking about a big thing. It's not a small thing to shepherd the people of God. It's easy to shrink it down, and we use the language of pastoral care, and some of them would have heard me say this before, and immediately we drift towards visiting housebound people, caring for people who are bereaved. And of course, that does represent part of pastoral care, but that's a small part of a much bigger thing. And the big thing is shepherding the whole people of God. And the question is, how do you and those that you pastor alongside, how are you going to go about that? And as soon as we say, well, that's what our topic is for today, how do you do the pastoring of the entire flock of God? Then to try and do this in a sort of webinar of, kind of 20 minutes, 30 minutes, just seems a little bit ridiculous. So I'm going to try and limit myself to kind of say what is different about this period of history. What peculiarities are there about what we're going through at the moment or have been going through that might help us? 6 things came to mind, and I'll work my way through this. The first thing that came to mind is, I think the obvious first thing to say is we need to listen harder in this period. I was talking to somebody, one of our home group leaders the other day, and they made this very interesting comment that Zoom somehow lures us into making declarations. When we're in Zoom meetings, you get lots of people who sort of declare things in a much more forthright way. It's something about the medium. I'm doing it now, declaring things to you. I mean, you've asked me to, but even when we get into a sort of small group gathering, people make these declarations. It's something about the medium that I think lures that out of us. And it's a slightly different way, therefore, of communicating. And I worry that we're not quite so good at listening and asking in our Zoom communications as we are face to face. And I think there's a desperate need to ask. It just strikes me that the experience of this ongoing social distancing lockdown is very, very different from person to person. So I think about a grandmother who has been locked down with their grandchild, and it has been a thrill and a delight. It's just been the loveliest thing that it happened that her daughter and her first grandchild ended up being locked down with her. And she couldn't be more delighted that she's had 3 months getting to know her granddaughter. Fantastic. And then I think about a single mother in a council flat with 2 toddlers, and not even a garden, never mind a balcony. It's such a different experience of lockdown. So we need to ask to understand how people have experienced lockdown. So listen harder. Second, I want to say listen between the lines. My other reflection here is that one of the things about Zoom communications, which we've come to both sort of love and hate, is that that they exclude the little on the edge conversations. They're very good for sort of getting us all together, and you know, they replicate kind of Bible study time, as it were. But when our home groups get together, there are lots of little on the edge conversations. Somebody arrives early and they chat with the leaders. Somebody hangs around at the end and they chat with the leaders. Two people wander out to the kitchen to make coffee and they have a little chat there. Zoom doesn't replicate those. And the loss of those on the edge conversations, I think, is really key, because those are often the places where you first get an inkling that things aren't right. Somebody first spills the beans on a difficulty that they're facing. And I think we need, therefore, to replicate or try and create alternatives for those kind of conversations. And I think we need to urge that on our small group leaders, on one another, your colleagues, your fellow elders, if you're in a team ministry, pastorally minded church members. Just help them to see that we need to find a way of listening between the lines at a stage where, you know, that's been relatively limited. Otherwise, we're going to miss things. And as it were, further down the line, what's going to pop up are, well, my next heading, trouble. I think we should anticipate that there will be trouble that is bubbling away under the surface, unobserved, during this lockdown phase. Striking phrase, lots of us have been reading sort of clever sort of cultural analysis type papers, haven't we? By people much cleverer than me who are sort of noticing things. And one phrase has stuck in my head, which is that the pandemic is not only a disruptor, we've all experienced that, but the pandemic is also an accelerator. It is speeding things on. And this particular paper was talking about speeding cultural change. But it strikes me that it will also be an accelerator of trouble. So if you've got a marriage that was struggling a bit, then the pandemic may well be the death of it. Because suddenly two people who are, you know, are struggling in their marriage are thrown together in a dramatic way, and it intensifies everything. And if they're struggling to make their marriage work, suddenly the wheels may come off. And I think we need to be alert to that. I think the implication of that is contact those who you know their marriage has been tricky over the last, you know, sort of year or two. Anticipate that it may well have got much worse. What it might not have done, God might have been gracious, and grace may have broken in, and it may have been a great time of blessing for them. But it'd be worth finding out, wouldn't it? I think similarly, we need to be alert to the possibility of domestic abuse. I've got my own sort of interesting experience in relation to domestic abuse. We had no domestic abuse at Christchurch at all. And then I did a course which involved me learning and thinking about domestic abuse. And the result of that course was, in the next 6 months, 3 men in our congregation started abusing their wives. And that was a funny thing, wasn't it? Why should that course have caused men in my congregation to start abusing their wives? Well, the answer is that they were doing it all along. The only thing that changed was that I noticed, because I was thinking about it. And we must think about it if we are going to spot domestic abuse. We've got to be willing to ask questions, and we need to be similarly alert to child abuse as well. Oh, sorry, I'm getting behind on my slides. How do we do that? I think you need to find good ways of asking questions. Here are some that occur to me. Should I be worried about you? Have you ever had a reason to feel frightened in your relationship? What's the worst that has happened? You can think of other questions. I don't think they're brilliant, but you know, just some way that is going to be enable you to just sort of invite the disclosure of, yes, things are actually serious. Things are difficult. Yes, I'm frightened. Yes, bad things are happening that I need help with. And remember that when you ask what's the worst that has happened, the answer that you will get to that question is likely to be about 30 to 50% of the worst that has really happened. You'll get a watered down version. So if you're hearing, you know, he slaps me sometimes, or he can sometimes shout at me, then you need to ramp that up considerably. to what is really going on. So just be alert to that, because it's so easy to assume that domestic abuse doesn't go on in our churches, not in my congregation, and we're naive if we think that's the case. But do be careful in communication. Bear in mind that email and texts may not be private. So think before you send an email or a text in this kind of territory. Okay, fourth listen. Listen for anxiety. It seems to me that this little period of time is full of the potential for anxiety. I remember very early on in the pandemic hearing a government official saying, with a sort of smile on her face, well, really, as we move into this, into the response to the pandemic, we all need to be a bit OCD now. And I remember at the time thinking, I wonder how people who've actually got OCD feel about, you know, that kind of little humorous remark. We all need to be a little bit OCD now. OCD is not a joke. It's not a sort of, you know, a little bit of a quirk. You know, once you've washed your hands for the 50th time that day, and they're red and raw, and you live in terror hour by hour, it's a miserable way to exist. And people who have got health fears, health anxieties, or a full-blown obsessive compulsive disorder, they are really going to be struggling in the additional phenomenon of the threat of COVID at the moment. How do we speak into that? Well, here's the point where I thought I would just give you a break from my sort of barrage of words and get you to do a bit of thinking on your own. So if you're willing to play the game, Mike will put us into groups in a second. And what I suggest is just glance over, you haven't got time to, we can have 5 minutes to do this. Just glance over the first 34 verses of Luke 12 and just think, if you happen to have that passage open in front of you, how would you use it to speak or indeed to preach? Because we need to preach into these issues as well. How would you use it to speak into the experience of anxiety? So, Mike, should we just I hope that was a useful discussion. I don't know where you got to with it. Let me throw you some thoughts from me about that. I think there are some obvious things to do from this sort of bit of the chapter. I think it was David Powlison who used the phrase functional orphans. And I love that way of describing what happens when we behave as if we have no Father in heaven, as if we have no God looking out for us. And we get that emphasis, don't we, in the latter part of the chapter. Your Father knows you need these things. So you know, why are you worrying? I love the bit earlier on about recognizing your inability. You know, since you can't do this little thing of adding an hour to your life, so much anxiety, I think, arises out of grandiosity. We imagine we are more capable than we really are, and that terrifies us. And actually, there is great blessing to realise that there's masses that, you know, there's so much that we're completely incapable of. So why are we worrying about it anyway? It's not within our compass to sort out. But I think the challenging bit, it seems to me, from this chapter, is to look at some of the earlier bits of the chapter, which you wouldn't immediately think about putting in front of somebody who's already anxious, because you feel as though you're just going to make things worse. We've been preaching our way through the latter part of, well, we've been preaching all the way through Daniel, but instead of stopping at the end of 6, we've pressed on into 7 through to 12. And I think we've had a great time there, recognizing that one of the things that God seems to do, speaking to this people in exile who are finding things really difficult, is to say, do you know, things are going to get worse. You know, you haven't seen anything yet. There's far worse to come. And in a funny kind of way, actually that puts your present worries in perspective. And I think that there's some of that in this chapter too. You know, worry about some bigger problems, like the fact that you're going to die and face judgment. You know, you fool. You know, this is how it's going to be for those who are not rich towards God, in the parable of the rich man who puts his stuff in his barns. You know, worry about the bigger things that are coming down the line. You know, you are mortal, and you have a judgment ahead of you. Or push it even harder than that and go to the early, you know, I'll tell you who you should fear. You know, what are you worrying about little things like COVID for? I mean, fear him who has authority to throw you into hell. Now, there's something really worth worrying about. Now, you've got to do that in a pastorally sort of wise way. But I do think that there is actually a huge blessing and calming by helping people to see that they need to get their fears into perspective, by realizing that there are much bigger, grander things at play. Could talk about that for more, but I'll leave that so that we have a little bit of time for to and fro. So those are some of the ways that I think that chapter would work. Fifth thing to listen for, I think listen for growth and decline. This is a new thought to me. It just come to me over the last week or so it's probably a bit unprocessed. But I have a sense that probably, having been extracted from the routines of our spiritual lives, going to church, meeting physically with home groups and whatever, I suspect that many believers are suddenly finding that it's down to them to make their spiritual lives work. And I think for some people that will have come as a real challenge to which God has gloriously enabled them to step up to. And it's been great for them spiritually, because they've realized that they've been coasting, just relying on structures and framework to just sort of chug along. But I suspect for others, the removal of that scaffolding has just caused them to collapse. So I think to be aware that you may find those two very different steps as a result of lockdown. Some thriving, others wilting. And then finally, I want to say, listen to yourself. Because I'm just on the back of a week off. So I had a sort of a week off and got back to work yesterday. And I think I didn't realise how tired I was. And just sort of 5 or 6 days off made a huge difference to me, and that's what I do over and over again. I get myself overtired. I don't realise quite how tired I am. I lose the ability to make decisions. That's one of my big things, actually. I don't know about screen fatigue. I think I'm in decision fatigue. I think I'm just exhausted by the barrage of things that need deciding. So many of them completely new. With new information to use around those decisions, and I think that has exhausted me. So just think carefully about your summer break. Think carefully about your autumn planning. Think carefully about whether you're trying to be a hero. We get confused, don't we, of the categories of hero, servants, and being wise. They get a bit muddled together, and we know we aren't supposed to try and be heroes, but sometimes in our desire to be a servant to everybody, actually we're drifting into wanting to be a hero, and we're drifting away from wisdom. We know we're supposed to acknowledge our fallibility, but we're not very good at it. And maybe this is a point where we need to get a little bit better at acknowledging our frailty, acknowledging our fallibility, acknowledging our finitude, and speaking more publicly about that. To wind back to some of the categories we've looked at earlier, where is your anxiety? What are you getting fretful about? Where is your trouble? For those of you who are married, how has lockdown been for your marriage? For those of you who are single, how has it been having this long period of isolation? Where are you in that? Beth and I, my wife and I, I reflect on the fact that this has been a period of married life unlike anything in our experience. We've had evening after evening together for month after month. That's never happened in our marriage ever, at any stage. How have we used it? What has it done to us? I think those are good questions for us to be asking. What's, as it were, written between your lines? Does anybody know? Have you got somebody to talk to about those kind of things? The church is full of fallen leaders, isn't it? And that ought to warn us not to let ourselves get there. The devil would love to torpedo under-shepherds because he knows how badly that will damage the flock. And you and I need to be ready to acknowledge our need and our struggle before we collapse. Who do you talk to about that? Who has your ear? Who do you trust to explain your struggles to? We need to be doing that. Last thing I want to say, is this all frustrating? You think you've just told us about listening. We just listen, 6 listens. I'm fed up with all this listening. I'm a preacher. I like talking. I've got a gospel to proclaim. You haven't told me anything about how to do that, apart from a little dip into Luke 12, which felt very inadequate. Yeah, okay. But how do you speak? Which words are you going to choose? Isn't that the issue? There are a lot of words in Scripture. There are a lot of things to say about Christ. How will you choose what to say? If you haven't listened, you don't know what to say. Scripture is always intentional. It always has a particular aim in its proclamation. It's not just generic truth. It's truth with a purpose. Ephesians is doing something different to Galatians. 1 Peter is doing something different to 1 Thessalonians. Why are the inspired writers declaring something different in each of those different epistles? Well, because they have listened carefully to the situation into which they're going to speak, and they speak specifically. That's why we need to listen. If we don't do that, we'll never speak effectively. So when do we get to speak? We get to speak after we've listened. And then we know which part of God's word to declare. There you go. Those are my thoughts. Mike, what are we going to do now? How am I doing on time? Not very well. Should we go into groups and just get people to sort of reflect a bit together and then come back for a Q&A? What do you want to do?
Yeah, let's do that. I'll break us into groups again. We can have a bit of time to reflect together. It'd be good to pray together as well. I'll give us 5 minutes or so to do this. So do spend a couple of minutes reflecting and a couple of minutes praying, and then I'll bring us back together again.